In this episode, we're still prepping for the Shotcrete crew. Back when we shot concrete for the bedrooms, we had to save some bits for later. For instance, this hallway section had to wait until the perimeter walls of the circle were done so it would have something to attach to. The half vault shape came from the same steel arches used to form the bedrooms. Then we set up a rebar framework, but it wouldn't catch all the shotcrete by itself. The lath keeps that shotcrete from just blowing through. Then we, and by we I mean mostly Sherry, pushed pieces of wire through to tie the lath to the rebar every 6 inches. Further over on the bedroom side of things, I'm basically putting up rebar, mostly freehand. This structure is made of concrete which has a pretty poor R value of about 0.07 per inch of thickness, or about 18 times worse than plywood or 70 times worse than insulation. The buried parts of the structure will be well insulated with extruded polystyrene, but these structures I'm prepping now will stick out of the earth so I can't have them thermally connected to the rest of the building, or they'll act like radiator fins and quickly drain the building's thermal potential. Instead, my plan is to cover the dormers with a 4-inch saddle of insulation and then build the concrete eyebrows outside of the thermal envelope. I started by attaching treated wood to the structure and then placing rebar into holes drilled in the treated wood. This is a compromise. The thermal performance would be improved if the eyebrows were just completely isolated and freestanding. But using those small screws to attach the wood directly to the building greatly simplified the build. From there, I just freeformed rebar to create the sort of earth-retaining shapes that I wanted. Of course, there were some measurements taken to have the right overhang to keep out the summer sun, and side flare had to be wide enough to have the views that we wanted. And I used a level to make sure that things that needed to be plumb were plumb, but mostly it was freehand. These little side fences were just a nice simple way to form the vertical parts, and then I added the arched parts after that. The black plastic flapping in the background was really just for keeping the sunlight off the Blue Max waterproofing, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to leave it on as an extra layer. We tried to use the laser level to match the heights of the eyebrows, but everything was too freehand for that to work too precisely, especially since we expected some unpredictable deformation once the concrete load was added. This closer view gives you a better shot of the wood blocks that held the rebar in the right locations without needing to actually drill it into the concrete. The rebar gets a bit floppy over longer lengths, so I decided to build a 2D truss for the wide span across the last eyebrow. We basically laid out rebar on the sand and welded a truss together. We made it symmetrical so it would curve evenly, and of course, because it's a 2D truss, it can only curve in the one direction, so it won't sag when we put it up in place. My initial attempt used the idea of a 3-4-5 triangle to mount the curved truss to the structure, but it ended up looking like a big sombrero. So, not on video, but we ended up cutting this down and putting up a less protruding version that you can see in the next shot. This is all freehand, so I had a wide range of possibilities, but I ended up deciding to make it look a bit scalloped. This allowed for maximum structural strength against the soil load with minimal light obstruction across the 3 windows. Back here to the south side, and it's time to put up the insulation saddle. 4 inches of Foamular 250 XPS, covered in lath and screwed into wood furring strips that were separately and sparsely attached to the concrete. Meanwhile, over here on the bedroom apps, you can see Sherry and one of the boys tying up the lath. A very tedious process. In this clip, I am pushing hydraulic cement into the gaps and cracks around the window bucks on the inside to keep the water from coming through later. We also decided to form up the greenhouse walls. We are trying yet another new style of construction. In this case, the steel forms the skeleton, and then we bolt the 2x12 boards to the top of the steel for easy attachment of other things later. We then form a curtain wall with steel studs. Here I'm welding up brackets to attach those to the I-beam. The studs are just hanging for now, but eventually we put in a floor track to secure the bottom edge to the footing. The window bucks are also cut to curve to match the I-beams and the footing track. Then we skin the wall with 2 inches of rigid insulation covered with lath. Later we come back and add 1 inch of shotcrete or stucco to the outside of this. And then we can come back later to fill the wall between the studs with sprayed in insulation to bring it up to R30. We added more studs on the inside just to give us more attachment points for the lath, and screws are placed every 8 inches. Back to the bedrooms, and you can see how we attach the 4 inches of XPS. The first layer is a mosaic of XPS and wood furring strips. It's a lot easier to lay it out together like this, rather than placing the furring strips first, and then risking that you will need to trim the XPS to fit. The red tape is just there to keep the pieces from blowing away while we puzzled it out. After getting the first layer in place, we can add the second right over the top of it and secure it all with screws through the lath and into those furring strips. These walls end up at roughly R20, but since the rest of the rooms will have a much higher R value and there will be zero infiltration and lots of thermal storage, I think it's an acceptable compromise. Here on the master bedroom apps, things are a bit more challenging because of all the curvature. Meanwhile, we're adding rebar over the insulation saddle on the other dormers. Again, a little tack welding, this time by my sister, goes a long way toward making this assembly much stiffer. And yes, you can weld rebar, you just need to follow the rules. With these last bits of rebar in place, we are ready for the Shotcrete crew. We decided to do a few things differently this time, such as putting in the drain tile, it's under the gravel in this picture already, before the Shotcrete crew so we wouldn't have to dig our way through the mess later. No real footage of that survived a data loss event, so here's another pic. For some reason this time we also had an epidemic of people posing for the time-lapse camera. In case those went by too quickly in the video, here are some stills. Sure, son, I can handle this board all by myself while you pose. Michael made a whole series of faces, and yet all very similar, and my favorite. Next, we'll get the Shotcrete crew out here, or maybe gunnite. If you want to encourage me to make that video, subscribe and hit the bell icon. If you want to jump ahead and see where we are now, check us out on Facebook. Link in the doobly-doo.